Surprise, we got a morning show for you. Friend Lucas Siegel's in the house. Whenever I want to talk some Warriors, some Giants, tie it in with what's going on with the 49ers, we bring Lucas in because he knows a whole lot more about the Warriors and the Giants than I do. But Lucas, we saw the other night, it wasn't an easy watch for Warriors fans. We saw I guess I should say potential end of a dynasty, but maybe I could just say the end of a dynasty, right? That was brutal. That loss to Sacramento. It wasn't pretty, and we were texting while watching that game, and both I think cringing. But it does seem that an era has ended. I do think though that it's important to kind of zoom out and appreciate just how good the past 10+ years have been.
Yeah, I mean, we've been lucky in the Bay Area in the last 30 years to have three different sports teams really have true dynasties. And if you want to extend out to Oakland for the baseball team in the late 80s, uh,
Mm.
there's been a lot of success in the Bay Area. The Warriors were the team to beat in the NBA for 5, 6, 7 years. And then every team geared up to beat exactly that archetype of team. You got long, young, athletic teams like the Thunder, like the Timberwolves, like the Bucks with Giannis that are just taking the league by storm and have made the Warriors look old and tired, which I think they are.
And you go back and you think, well, the 49ers of the 80s and 90s obviously had their run. That was 5 titles. The Warriors won 4. They won 1 pre-Durant and they won 1 post-Durant, 2 there in the middle with Kevin Durant. I thought they were going to have 3, but obviously those injuries hit in that one season to both Durant and Klay Thompson. And then the Giants, they won 3 in 5 years. So, you as time passes, and it's been the longest since the Giants dynasty, the 49ers dynasty, right? As time passes, you kind of put roses around the ending. You think that they just won a Super Bowl and all rode off into the sunset. That wasn't the case with the 49ers. It wasn't the case with the Giants winning a World Series and riding off into the sunset. They struggled after, and obviously it's been a couple years now since the Warriors won their last title, and that ending has been painful as well. So, I think that we're going to eventually look at this Warriors team and mention it in the same breath as those 49ers teams of the 80s and 90s because they won 4. 4 is almost 5, right? It's probably not going to be quite at that level unless they can sneak one more in with a different cast around Steph. But it is, I think, important to remember that the 49ers didn't die a peaceful death either, right? It was tough there toward the end, just like it has been for this Warriors team.
Dynasties don't end well. I think the reason that the Bulls of the late 90s are so celebrated and have that documentary about them and are viewed in that rare air is they rode off into the sunset. I
Yeah.
can't think of another real sports dynasty where that happened. Like even with Tom Brady with the Patriots, that ended poorly with his last pass being a pick 6 in a Patriots uniform, and then that Bucks cameo that also didn't end ceremoniously. Dynasties, because it's really hard to give up on a dynasty when you're still at the top. You want to show that you can't do it anymore before you tear it down and start over again. But unfortunately, we saw with the Niners in the late 90s when Steve Young got the concussions and the salary cap came in and they just couldn't do it anymore. You saw it with the Giants when they were the worst team in baseball from 2017 through 19, got rid of Bochy, went with the new analytics guys in the front office. And unfortunately, I think we're going to see that with the Warriors as well in the next couple of years here.
Yeah, well, the Warriors, it's super interesting, and maybe there's even some parallels to the 90s Niners because the early 90s to the 94 team, those were all-star teams. I mean, the greatest NFL team ever assembled might have been the 1994 49ers just based on the talent. So that's the last time they won a Super Bowl. After that, they didn't have quite the same amount of talent, but they still had Steve Young and they still had Jerry Rice. They still had these big contracts and superstar players, but those guys started aging, right? They were a little bit past their primes, although Jerry Rice's prime seemed to last forever, but they didn't quite have the same supporting cast around them. And I look at the Warriors in a similar way, and the Warriors right now, just like the Niners still had Steve Young and Jerry Rice into the late 90s, the Warriors are still going to have Steph Curry, at least him, right? I don't know what they're going to do with other pieces. We can talk a little bit about that. But for the 49ers, it was a rush to try to see what they could fit around Young and Rice to see if they can maybe beat the Packers and get all the way to the Super Bowl. They got, I think the closest they got is when they did beat Green Bay and they advanced to Atlanta with Terrell Owens the catch, but then Garrison Hurst broke his leg against Atlanta and that was over. But when you look at this Warriors team, is it possible for them to rearrange the deck chairs in a way that gives them one more bite of the apple, or do you think that it is rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic at this point? Is it too late to win one with Steph? Is my question.
I think the big difference between the 90s and now is how much power the players have. For all we, I mean, this is not going to happen, but for all we know, LeBron James could say, "I'll play for the league minimum. I'm a billionaire already. I will sign with the Warriors and team up with Steph and Draymond and maybe Clay and go make a run at a title to cement our legacies in our era in this sport." It's not going to happen. But if LeBron James said, "I'm going to play on the Warriors next year," which he could do, he has that ability to do that. They'd be the favorites to win the title, most likely, even with 40-year-old LeBron James and 37-year-old Steph.
That would be so cool because it'd be like old guys against, I don't know, like Boston, right? That's the powerhouse now. It's a younger team, so it'd be like the old guys' pride. We're working against the younger guys. I mean, that would be neat.
There are so many reasons why it won't happen, but you see the players requesting trades all the time. You can tie into the 49ers potentially this offseason. It's probably the biggest in the NBA with James Harden and Kyrie Irving, and they for the most part just kind of go where they want nowadays, irrespective of their contracts, especially in basketball. So I think the interplayer politics aren't something to ignore. But if you're just looking at the roster at face value and the assets and the draft capital and the contracts, if you're the Warriors, where do you go from here? Because Steph can't do it alone, and you don't have the pieces anymore to compete night in and night out with the best in the league. You had games this year where they looked great, competing with the Nuggets, the Thunder, the Wolves, beating the Celtics. But it's an 82-game season and then a long postseason, and they can't do it anymore.
Yeah, and to me, Steph looked tired. He looked really, really tired on, what was it, Tuesday night? I mean, some of those turnovers. He showed up to
the arena with a wrap on his hand.
Yeah. He had gotten banged up toward the end of the regular season. Also, some of the ankle issues seemed to flare back up. But understandably, I mean, he's older now. They've been on so many deep postseason runs. And the league around him gets younger and younger, obviously, in relation relative to his age every single season. So it's going to be tough to be able to compete in game. What was this, game 83? Yeah, it was after an 82-game season. So, when we look at what the Niners had to do in the 90s, when they tried to hang on for dear life and it didn't work, finally, when Steve Young suffered that concussion, after Aeneas Williams hit him on Monday Night Football against the Arizona Cardinals, that was when the dam ruptured. And a team that had winning records in essentially every single season since 1981, I think minus one season. I think it might have been one of the strike seasons. But it was 82, I believe, that right after the Super Bowl where the 49ers, that was the 1 year where they weren't a winning team. They didn't make the playoffs in 91, but they went 10-6. So, I mean, this was the longevity of that dynasty was impressive. It lasted nearly 2 decades, but the dam finally ruptured when Steve Young suffered that concussion. They went 4-12, and that's the point where they said, okay, we can't hold on to this anymore. They were able to keep Jerry Rice. Yeah.
You can look at dam rupturing moments with just about every dynasty. The Giants in 2016, they had the Cubs in Game 4, and they lost the lead in the ninth inning, and then lost 95 games the next year. You hold on, and then the string just breaks, and you can't do it anymore. And I think that's what happened with the Niners, like you were saying. It's what happened with the Giants, and I think that Tuesday night might have been that moment for the
it seems that you have to have a dramatic moment because otherwise the nostalgia will always win out. It's kind of like a frog in boiling water, right? You put the frog in the water and it's not boiling yet. The frog doesn't notice the temperature slowly increasing, but it will die. So these teams are like these frogs in boiling water. It's probably already over for them. The water's probably already gotten too hot, but they haven't noticed. So for them to notice, for them to change course, sometimes you need to have that big dramatic moment. Sometimes that
Yeah,
fire needs to come. So for the Niners, it was
you can
Young
point
and
to
Aeneas
that.
Williams. Go
You
ahead.
can point to that in the late '90s when the Niners were hanging on and losing in the playoffs every year before Young got hurt. You can point to that with the Giants that 2016 year where you thought the even year magic might come back, and you can point to that last year when the Warriors weren't good enough. We're never going to be good enough, but somehow beat the Kings and then pushed the Lakers enough to give you that little sense of hope.
Well, what do you get of all this rhetoric? Is this just them trying to process the end of the season? There's so much talk about this guy, speaking specifically of Klay Thompson. He absolutely has to finish his career as a Warrior. I mean, to me, it sounds like Steve Kerr just wants to keep everybody together and go for it again, even though logically it doesn't make much sense. Is that something that's possible, or do you think that they see it the same way that we do, and that they're going to have to strip this down now and just rip off that Band-Aid and move forward?
They're competitors. I mean, they never think they're not good. They never are going to acknowledge that they're not good enough. But I think we saw moments with Klay this year where he was coming to terms with the player he is now. Now I think he's still a very valuable NBA player. He has gravity unlike any other player in the league, with the exception of Steph Curry. You have to guard him, no matter if he's shooting over 10 or 10 for 10. He's a capable defender, but he's not a 2 anymore. He's a 3, maybe a 4. And he's going to have a lot more cold shooting nights than he used to. You can say the same about Kevon Looney, who's a little older and slower. Draymond Green had a great year this year, actually, when he was available and healthy.
Yeah.
I thought he looked better than he had in a couple of years. But even Steph Curry looked more tired than than he had in the past, and felt like he had a little bit more responsibility and a little bit less ability to do it. And when you couple that with the league getting younger and better, the only path forward for the Warriors to get back close to the mountaintop is for young players to take massive steps forward. We thought we saw that with Kuminga a little bit this year. He's going to have to be a 25-point per game guy if they're going to be any good. Klay can't be a number 2 option.
Yeah, it's fascinating to me because this is true across all team sports. I think increasingly they've become young men's games, right? That you can have your superstars, the guys that can defy time for at least a certain amount of time, but the surrounding cast always has to stay young. The supporting cast, the B-listers, the glue of the team, can never be this aging, decrepit structure. And I think that the Warriors crossed over into the danger zone there. I think the Giants of last decade crossed over into that danger zone. It ends up being a fatal zone. And that's why this draft for the 49ers is so important, because this is no longer a young team. I mean, these guys have been around the block several times, 4 NFC championship games, 2 Super Bowls. I still remember us talking about this team as the young up and comers, and Kyle Shanahan and John Lynch took over, and they brought in George Kittle, and they signed Kyle Juszczyk. And I mean, all these guys that were still ascending into their primes, they're either in their primes or maybe now on the slow, but it is an inevitable descent into their post primes. So the 49ers obviously are still getting productive football out of all these players. With Eric Armstead, they decided, okay, we can't have this anymore because he's missing too many games. But the core is still extremely productive and extremely talented. But with this draft, they have repeatedly mentioned that they need to infuse youth into the rest of the roster. You can have 10 star players, but you still need 43 more to fill out the 53 man. And that's why these 10 picks coming up in a week from today, I think are so important. You have to find guys that not only can fill the back end spots on a cost controlled basis, Lucas, but also guys that can compete with other teams' youth. Because otherwise, you're going to have a paper tiger. You can have the best team on paper. Philadelphia in what year was it? 2011. They had the greatest NFL team ever assembled. They thought at the time, at least in the post salary cap era, they were terrible. And it's because they weren't good at the margins. So this draft is about avoiding, for the 49ers, avoiding what has happened to the Warriors and the Giants.
Yeah, I mean, that's the best way to put it. You have your A-listers. I think a lot of them are still going to be in their primes, but you got guys that are getting old, and especially in football, more so than I think any other sport. Players don't age gracefully. There's a reason the NFL is called the not for long league. As you have these guys approaching 30, passing 30, they're still going to be able to do their jobs, but they might miss more games, and you're going to have to win games when they're out, and you're going to have to supplement that, as you said, with guys that are going to bring speed and power and explosive plays. Maybe not just scoring touchdowns, but making a difference on the field and supplementing those guys.
This is the depth chart right now, and you could see we color coded it. We have the teal for players brought in from other teams, and we saw erosion already this past year. So we talk about the erosion that we've seen for years now from the Warriors. The 49ers defense went from number 1 to number 12 by the advanced metrics. So look at all the work they've done on the defensive side of the ball, which is right here. There's a whole lot of teal in this part of the depth chart. They've essentially reworked the defense at both levels, on the first string and the second string. The defensive line has 4 new bodies. The linebacker position, by necessity, you had to bring in somebody who's going to be able to spell Dre Greenlaw in case he's not back by week 1. I think we've seen movement on the secondary. This is all before the draft. So they plugged some holes and they feel that they raised the ceiling. They've gotten younger. A great example is Malik Collins instead of Eric Armstead. Jordan Elliott instead of Javon Kinlaw. They think that, even though they're the same age, Elliott's been more available than Kinlaw. Yetur Gross-Matos, and even an older guy like Leonard Floyd hasn't missed a game in, I think 108 games. He's very, very durable. So what they're doing is they're trying to bring at least youth-like properties to the team. They're trying to bring availability to the team. They're trying to raise the floor. But now comes the draft, and this is a strategy question, and this is the kind of stuff that I think that you're really, really good at talking about, just because of your background, knowing the NBA and knowing baseball. So it's asset management, right? Trade up, trade down, or stay put. So here's the thing. The 49ers have 10 picks, but they also have this extremely crowded roster. So every single one of these picks, you want to make sure that they at least have a chance to compete for a roster spot. But just by the way the math works out, they're probably not all going to make the roster. Maybe only 5 of them, maybe only 3 of them makes the roster because of how crowded it is. That being said, there are 2 ways to look at the draft. You could look at it that way. You could say, okay, well, we better trade up and consolidate picks since, we don't have a lot of roster room. Or you can look at the draft as a crapshoot, and you could say, I want more darts to throw at the wall. So I'll trade down and I'll have 13 picks because I don't know. Even if my top 2 picks are guaranteed to make the roster, I'd rather just have more darts to throw at the wall. The prime example of the first strategy is Trey Lance, right? The first strategy of consolidating picks, moving up and saying, okay, we got our guy. That didn't work out though, did it? The prime example of the other strategy is Brock Purdy. The very last pick of the draft is the one that's one of the best players in the league right now. So what do you think the 49ers do? Or if you don't know what the 49ers do, what are your thoughts on the differing approaches they can take? Because philosophically, they're very different, but they're both available to the 49ers. They can trade up, they can trade down, or obviously they can also stay put with their 10 picks.
I think recent history has scared me a little bit away from saying trade up. That Trey Lance trade, tough in hindsight, especially looking at what you got out of Brock Purdy with the last pick of the draft. But you also, like you said, you want to pick guys that you think are going to have a shot at making the roster. Ultimately, I don't think trading up makes sense for the 49ers. Kyle Shanahan and John Lynch, they've been better at picking late round guys than they have at picking early guys. I think part of that might be what they're looking for. They've taken some project picks early on in the draft, saying, "Oh, we're going to develop them. We're going to turn them into great NFL players." But with a team right now that is officially in win now mode, you're not playing for the future. If you're the Niners, you got to win as you have these guys approaching and exiting the peaks of their careers. I think you got to, if you're going to trade up, it's got to be NFL ready guys that you are pretty confident you're going to plug in and play. But I think the best approach is probably to stay put for the most part. And take guys that you think have a shot at supplementing this roster, especially given how strong the top level of the roster is. You need depth guys. And the best way to do that is by having more darts, in my opinion, especially for
Yeah.
Lynch and Seaman.
So I think we're in agreement. I've done one mock draft where I traded up just to illustrate what that would look like for the 49ers. And it wasn't my prediction of what they're going to do. It was just simply a look at the potential strategy. And I think when you look at this team, the one area that they really haven't worked on yet, as far as bringing in outside players this offseason, is right here, is the offensive line, which also happens to be what was statistically the worst part of the team, at least in pass protection last year. You can get better at right tackle. You can get better at center, but maybe not immediately with the rookie. You can also get better at, like, not necessarily this year, but 2 years from now, where you have a lot of guys on expiring contracts. Like Aaron Banks is no longer under contract past 2024. Trent Williams is under contract, but he's 36. So obviously some investment in that offensive line is necessary, but I think that the right tackle spot is the one where investment now in the right player can raise both the floor and the ceiling of this team, right? Because Colton McKivitz isn't that good. That's the one spot where I think that a trade up could directly positively impact the 49ers. So that's why I did the mock draft with Troy Fotanu, who's the tackle out of Washington. I think they're scouting the other guy harder, Roger Rosengarten. They're there for a workout for Roger Rosengarten, who was the right tackle for Washington on the opposite side of Fotanu, who was the left tackle. But anyway, there's just a minuscule chance that they draft any particular player. But we use these players to illustrate points. And I think a really quality offensive tackle is something that would make sense in both the short term and the long term as far as a trade up investment. But if that guy doesn't pan out, and that's the chance with any draft pick, I don't think there are any sure things in the NFL draft. All of a sudden, you burned a whole heck of a lot of draft capital to move up. I calculated it might take 3 valuable picks to move up enough to get this guy at number 18. And then maybe that wouldn't even guarantee the job. So then you don't have some of these picks down the road, and then you lose your ability to fortify the part of the roster that really matters when it comes to winning Super Bowls. Because as good as this team is on the front line, if these guys, the second and third stringers, aren't up to par, let's face it, you're not winning the Super Bowl. So they've got to hit on the picks that people aren't paying as much attention to. Once Saturday afternoon rolls around, that's where the 49ers have made hay there in the past, in the 5th to the 7th rounds. Kittle to Brock Purdy, Jawan Jennings has been in those rounds. If they don't make hay there, that's when this team is really going to start showing cracks.
Yeah, I think you said it. There definitely is an argument for trading up if you're confident you're going to get your guy, and that guy's going to be the guy. I do think right tackle needs to be addressed in some way, especially because it's, as a player gets better, it's not necessarily an uncommon transition to go from right tackle to left tackle once Trent Williams decides he's done playing. The offensive line, there are a lot of reasons we did win the Super Bowl a couple months ago. I think probably, in my opinion, the number one reason is the offensive line. There were a couple key plays where, whether it was missed blocking assignments or Purdy not having enough time to make throws to open guys, you can look at 5 or 6 plays and say, if there's protection on this play, that's in all likelihood a first down or a touchdown. And the goal is obviously to win the Super Bowl this year. You can't do that. I don't think you can win a Super Bowl with Colton McKivitz at right tackle. I think that's just a very frank way of putting it.
So do you here's the question then. Is it possible to find a tackle that would be good enough to eventually start this year? Maybe not week 1, but would be good enough to eventually start without trading up? Can you have your cake and eat it too? At least stay put. I think that might be what they see out of Roger Rosengarten. That's who they worked out in Washington this past weekend. I think he's probably going to go in the 2nd, maybe the 3rd round. But history tells us that it's really hard to find starters at tackle, especially plug-and-play guys, beyond the top half of the 1st round. That's one of the easier positions actually to scout, in that the track record is more clear when you look at, okay, this guy was drafted here, he's probably going to be good. It's still a crapshoot, but it's way clearer than a position like quarterback. Nobody knows what the hell they're doing when they're scouting and evaluating quarterbacks, right? So is it possible for the 49ers to have their cake and eat it too in that regard?
I think so. I do. I think they like Rosengarten, and they obviously went out and talked to him. As you said, very low likelihood of any individual player being drafted by any individual team. But I think the fact that those interactions are taking place with, as you said, a second, third round guy indicates that I don't think the Niners are sold on trading up to go get a tackle, because
I don't think they've interviewed any of the guys that are supposed to be, or interviewed. They haven't hosted any of the top guys on the top 30 visit list. I think it's a great point.
I don't think that the plan right now, obviously a lot can change in the next week, and a lot can change in one night next week in 30 minutes when you see a guy get picked that you might not even have on your radar. But I do think that the plan right now is to stay put or trade down, maybe see if you can get a couple second round picks and take a couple lower risk flyers on guys that you think can make an impact this year, because you got the offensive line. And then, as you said, you got to really fill out that second string and make sure that any one injury, with the exception of maybe quarterback, which is pretty hard to protect against, to make sure that any one injury doesn't send your season into a tailspin.
The 49ers visit list seems really, really concentrated around guys projected to go between 30 and 70. Like that they really like that middle part of the draft. And I think that's, obviously where their picks start. They start at number 31. And that's where they can really,
I wonder if they try to get 3 picks in there rather than 2.
Yeah. Get one more, throw at that dartboard. And again, the better drafts, in my experience, that when I've just watched these things play out, are the ones that aren't considered the sexiest drafts at the time that the picks are made.
Yeah.
But 2, 3, 4 years later, you're like, oh, I see what that team was doing. I mean, they really built up a monster quietly, because again, there are no sure things in the NFL. You could talk about Peyton Manning and Andrew Luck, and those were high probability players to be really damn good. But there have also been a lot of number one picks that have completely flamed out. So even at the very top of the draft, there's going to be teams that leave this weekend and the media is going to declare them winners of the draft, and they picked up a lot of sexy names. There's a really good chance that's not going to be a good draft once we look at it in 2 or 3 years, right? So it's the meat and potatoes of the draft a little bit later on. It's not the sizzle, right?
I think especially for good teams. The Niners aren't looking, they're not looking right now for the next superstar. They have their superstars. They're looking for the guys that are going to keep these superstars at the top and ultimately get them from right below the summit to the summit.
Let's talk Brandon Aiyuk to wrap up, and then we could bring it back quickly to the Warriors and the Giants and sustaining dynasties and all that good stuff. But Aiyuk obviously is related to all these plans. I think the reason that people are bringing him up, besides trying to get clicks for cheap, is that they think that he might have some trade value for the 49ers to potentially allow them to address that offensive line in a more profound way. To that, though, I point out how damn good Brandon Aiyuk has been, and he's Purdy's main guy at this point. This is a team that's obviously, you just mentioned it. This is a really good team that's trying to win right now. You would be trying to theoretically plug a different hole by creating a whole new one, because that's how good Aiyuk is. I don't see the 49ers in any position to be risking getting worse at this point. I think all of their moves have indicated that they're trying to get better. They're trying to kick down the door and win the championship, which is why whenever I see some of these hypothetical Brandon Aiyuk trade scenarios, I'm like, what would the 49ers even be doing? I mean, you'd be walking on a treadmill at best with some outside shot of getting a little bit better, maybe like a 2% shot. It wouldn't be a high probability play. Is that the way that you see it too? I just don't believe that the 49ers are in any position to start giving up one of the most valuable pieces in football.
Absolutely. I agree with you 100%. I think I'm a massive fan of Brandon Aiyuk. I think you can make an argument that he's more valuable than Samuel in some ways, than Kittle in
Oh
some
yeah,
ways, just because of the different lens that you can view the offense through when he's playing. He offers that over the top ability, and he's been Purdy's go-to guy in the red zone, like you said. Uh, if you think of so many of Purdy's highlights from this last year, they involve Ayuk. He was the most targeted, the most yards, and I think he's underappreciated by 49ers fans, but I don't think he's underappreciated within the organization. And they're going to have
that's
to
a
figure
good
out how
point.
to mend that relationship. But we saw with Samuel a couple years ago where he wanted out and they had to figure that out. Obviously, in hindsight, they made the right choice keeping Samuel around. They're going to have to, and they will make that same choice with Ayuk.
Well, mending relationships, I think giving out a good contract, a good fair contract always tends to do that. And the big difference here is that, Samuel requested a trade. He wasn't at any of the off-season workouts
Yeah,
except for the
Ayuk has
mandatory
just been
one.
cryptic thus far.
Yeah, and this I think this Ayuk situation is going a whole lot more smoothly actually in relation to that. Oops, I didn't mean to knock you off there. I'm trying to put this up on the screen for us. Hold on. I have basically the illustration of how damn good Brandon Ayuk has been this season in this article up on The Athletic. I think I could zoom in a little bit. So, have you seen this? I don't know if you've seen this when I put it on Twitter. It's an XY chart. Receiver separation grade is on the x-axis. Catch point and yak grade is on the y-axis. You see all these good receivers in the top right. Look where Brandon Ayuk is.
Yeah.
My cursor's hovering over
He's
it.
special. I mean, he runs with the ball like Debo and McCaffrey and Kittle, but he gets open in ways that they don't, and that
And he
adds a
blocks.
whole level to the offense.
The way that he blocks too is so important with how
Yeah.
the 49ers do this. And just from an organizational building standpoint, this is a guy that has earned his reps, that Kyle Shanahan coaches receivers very particularly. And there was a time in, what was it, 2021, over the first 6 games where he was still playing. It wasn't like they just banished him and said, okay, you're not playing, but he wasn't getting the main target share early in the season. Only had a few catches because they weren't fully happy with the way that he was doing things. They said, you got to do it the 49er way. You have to buy into the system fully. And to his credit, he did.
Yes.
He started getting a whole lot more of the target share down the stretch of that season. And then he took off as a 1,000-yard guy last year. And, he has been the poster child of buying in, draft and develop. And the third part of draft and develop is draft, develop, and pay. And I think that from an organizational standpoint, you do that to set a good example moving forward. So I
Yeah.
think it's where
You
the
always say
49ers
pay the A-listers. You always say pay the A-listers and plug in and replace the B-listers. Ayuk has more than shown that he's an A-lister. So
are.
you kind of answer the question for yourself there.
Yeah, this is the A-lister evidence. I mean, you're
Yeah.
not at this part of the graph if you're not an A-lister. So I think it's as simple as that. So anyway, we talked about the ends of the dynasties. Now the 49ers, I don't think they have a dynasty yet right now. They didn't win a Super Bowl before we start talking about that in this era, but they had a dynasty in the 80s and 90s. And so many parallels, I think, between the way that died for the 49ers, the way that the Giants died out, and now that we've seen the Warriors die out. But I mean, you're familiar with all three of these. It does seem to me like the 49ers right now, if they can kick the door down and win a Super Bowl, they might be ready to be as sustainably, successful as, it's hard to say the Niners of the 80s or 90s, but with Purdy being so young and with the structure and the culture they have in place right now, it does seem they can be good for a long time, longer than even the Warriors and the Giants were in their recent runs of success.
Yeah. I mean, I think the only scary part is the Niners have been really good for the last 5 years,
Yeah.
and
It's already quite a bit of
it's really
time,
hard
right?
to sustainably be good. And that's why you said I think why this draft is so important, because in order to be good for the next 5 years, you got to have guys coming in now rather than guys who are just in their primes now. Because no matter what happens in the next few years, George Kittle, Debo Samuel, In 5 years, they're not going to be the players they are today. So you got to have guys that are going to come up and keep it going.
Yeah, so that's another that's a good parting thought. This draft, it's so important for the 49ers not only to get that youth infusion to be competitive at the margins for now, but at least a couple of these players have to have true upward mobility to become the stars of the future, because you will start to see the declines of these older players hasten over the next few years, right? So you can't just be at replacement level every year. Like, it's great to bring in replacement B-list players and then you could draft the next guys, but every once in a while you've got to hit on the big ticket guy. And the 49ers were doing that like on an annual basis for a while there, right? George Kittle 2017, Fred Warner 2018, Nick Bosa 2019. I mean, they were adding A-listers, and they still have been. I guess I can't say that in the past tense. They added Brock Purdy in 2022. So, and Deebo Samuel, obviously, in 2019 as well. Brandon Aiyuk in 2020. Every single season seems that they succeeded in the draft. 2021, that was a little rougher. They thought it was going to be Trey Lance. But anyway, that has to continue. You still have to land at least one of these guys every 2 years to make sure that A-list core can sustain itself. I think that's a great point. Cool stuff, man. Well, I have to get going. Time kind of snuck up on us. Every time that we need to talk about the Warriors, the Giants, and 49ers perspective, we bring Lucas in, good friend of the show. So thanks, Lucas. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. Excited to watch the draft next week and see what happens.
Yeah, we're 1 week away. All right, everybody, we'll talk to you very soon. We'll have Lucas on soon, maybe after the draft, to take a look at how well the 49ers did infuse their roster with youth. Everybody have a good day. We'll talk very shortly.